I know it's been a while since we did another cat chat, but we're back to talk about some stuff and some other stuff. Just Zan here again, as normal.
Oh,
So we might as well start with what we have in the title. Inspired by Zan, or well, by inspired I mean he tagged me in Discord and said we do cat chat with this title. So here we are. So this is Mythic Plus talents primarily, and it's Moment of Clarity and Predator. So yeah, obviously Predator, significant loss in single target,
very.
like really significant loss in single target. So potentially this becomes relevant in Mythic Plus, which I know where you wanted to talk about it. So
Yeah,
yeah,
because there's been a lot of people asking about this because there are a few firms that run it in logs, I guess, or I don't know where people look for talents, but people notice that some high-end, Mythic Plus runs have been done with Predator and Moment of Clarity. And I guess actually Sim kind of help people into that as well, because I think for a lot of people, especially if you already have a bunch of Wildflat running on your gear from other, just in
I
general,
imagine you
as you
probably
have it.
do if you're doing M Plus because it is one of the better M Plus AOE
Yeah, and I
strength
mean it's on
traits.
a lot of gear pieces,
Yeah,
and it's not a bad rate. So then you may notice that Predator and Moc can sim ahead of Blood Talents and Sabretooth. So Predator is slightly overvalued. So first of all, I guess we should just address dungeon slice sims, because I know if you play multiple classes, many classes really are not a big fan of that sim profile. And for some legitimate and some what I would consider less legitimate reasons. But what I will say is for Feral, I think the bias in that sim profile is not in the direction of AoE, which is very important, right?
it's quite
It's
boss
actually
heavy, isn't
probably,
it?
yeah, it's much heavier on single or like 1-2 target stuff than the average. Probably is not by like a massive, not by as much as some people claim, but certainly by
Especially when
some
you
amount.
consider reaping.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Although I would argue whether that's
Whether or not
important
you
or
should
not
be
is a
building towards
different
reaping.
discussion.
Yeah,
Yeah, but what I will say is, for us, that is relevant in the opposite direction. So, for example, if Moc and a Predator build would sim ahead in a dungeon slice sim, keep in mind that that makes it likely that the sim is actually underreporting how good that build is, rather than the opposite. So, because it is skewed to single target, where Sabretooth and Bloodthorns are definitely better. But anyway, so that build on AoE, and it's definitely very viable. And I would even say, not sure if I would say it's recommended, just flat out. I think both. I think.
I think if you're thinking about whether or not you should choose Predator and Moment of Clarity versus just taking Sabretooth and Blood Talons, and you can't make that decision for yourself, odds are you should probably just go for Sabretooth.
Yeah, it's safer for sure. The Sabretooth build means that worst case, you lose a little bit on your AoE packs, and you get, you do okay anyway. Whereas the Predator build, so the Predator build isn't as bad as single target as people claim. That's important to note. Like, if we think about DPS, yeah, so on a plus boss, say it lasts maybe 1 to 2 minutes, that's pretty normal. For me, for example, I might do 20, 21k DPS instead of 25k DPS to that boss, which is a significant loss, obviously. But it is not
It's not a great
like
loss in
that's the
terms of
type of
time.
distance, right? Yeah, that's the difference we're talking about when we talk about a big loss, right? 3-4k DPS on single target is significant, but it isn't so significant that the AoE gain is completely irrelevant, right? And therefore, you can run the Predator Moc build, which is definitely better than AoE, especially, and this is important for Predator, less so for Moc. If you're chain pulling packs or you're pulling reaping packs to bosses and stuff like that, which is not that uncommon in hierarchies, and if you go fast just normally, Predator is very valuable. Whereas if you have a lot of breaks and a lot of small pulls, Predator is much less valuable because you regen between every pack anyway, so that's a lot of energy you just get for free essentially when you're not doing anything. But if you're chain pulling a lot, or you're pulling with the bosses, or you're doing very large packs, then Predator will actually just generate a boatload of energy, and that's basically when it's good, right? That's what the talent does.
Yeah. So it's important to consider that the more action you're getting in the key and the more AoE you're doing, the better Predator is. But if you're doing a weekly key and just chilling out, running through, Sabretooth is probably going to be where you're at.
And I feel like this isn't super important for people, like just in general, like if you are like, oh, should I do this to this? It doesn't matter really for your performance. So like I said, like you're talking about maybe average overall DPS difference of like 1-2k across a dungeon, which, you know, an average DPS might be like around 30k. I don't know. That's just my gear. It depends on the dungeon and stuff, obviously. Say you do 30k DPS overall in a dungeon, then, you know, it might be 1-2k up or down. That's the type of differential we're talking about. But that obviously means that both of those talents are very valuable, especially situationally. I would say it probably depends on the key, which is better. Like King's Rest, I mean, you probably shouldn't do King's Rest, but if you somehow are doing King's Rest, you definitely should probably be using Sabretooth, right? That's pretty obvious. Whereas if you're doing Freehold, you know, yeah, then it may not matter. Like even if it's like the worst case scenario, like Tyrannical, and you have like bolstering or something, I don't know, so that you don't do very big pulls. Even then, you know, the mock build is probably fine. Um,
Yeah,
but it is kind of, yeah.
I remember having a look at this a while back when it's sort of just started boiling up, and obviously people started. I think there's some feral streamer who's been doing it, and that's why it's popped up. Um,
Sure.
but I remember I had a look at one of Hoof's logs on a fortified teaming, so like probably one of the better outcomes for Predator, and it was something like Predator would have needed to do 7% more damage on AoE to have beaten the damage he gained on bosses from Sabretooth, which is like a reasonable amount. Obviously, like if you're pulling ideally for Predator, it could do that, but just to stress,
Oh yeah, yeah,
it's
very easily.
insanely marginal and like yeah, it's super close as to which you're choosing.
Yeah, I do feel it mostly comes down to preference, and I would say on AoE packs like the Mock Predator build is pretty smooth because you're basically just going swipe into PW
Yeah,
or
it's
nowhere,
something
and
I've complained about before playing not Predator. It feels super AIDS when you have to like save Tiger's Fury potentially because a boss is coming up or something,
yeah, yeah,
and you're
yeah, yeah.
like on a pack and you off cooldown, you have no energy, and you're like, do I use it here and not have it for the boss, or do I save it and this feels shit?
Yeah.
Predator kind of addressed that, so yeah, it does feel better. Of course, we all experienced that in Legion playing with Predator.
And I mean, it also for stuff like explosive, for example, right? Like Feral isn't like we are okay at killing explosives, right? We aren't the best, we aren't the worst, but I feel like when even if you can't get a predator proc from explosives because Rake one shots them or whatever, which that's a really annoying thing, by the way.
Yeah,
I would hope they would fix that eventually. Would be nice.
it was okay in
Regardless,
Legion, but yeah,
yeah. Well, I
because
don't
in
know. I
Legion you
never.
could just one combo point rip them, and that was fine.
Yeah,
But now combo points have value on AoE, so
true, true. Yeah, one combo point rips were a bit. Yeah. Anyway, that like it still makes it nicer because you have constant stream of energy. So it means that when you're swapping, even if you have to shred them or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Like you will still have enough energy that it doesn't feel really bad. Whereas if you're running the more Sabretooth build, Bloodhounds build, uh, you know, it's different because it feels a bit annoying. You can be very low on energy sometimes, and not for a long period of time, but say, you know, for 10 seconds or something. And if it's a big pack at that specific time, or for example, if you have to, like you have a big mob, right, and you need to burst it down for whatever reason, so you use your Tiger's Fury and then there's a reaping and you don't have TF for like 20 seconds during that reaping, or, you know, the stuff, situations like that, which Predator just solves and makes really nice. I would say though, like, I don't think it's not like you must run Mock just because you're on Predator or vice. Like, they kind of matter because typically, you know, they're typically good in this similar situation, but they aren't married to each other, and it's really important. They aren't requirements. Like, it's probably pretty likely that you could find yourself in a situation where like Blood Talons and Predator is fine, for example. Like, it would have a similar AoE thing, whereas Yeah, Moc is mostly about wild flesh rending relics, and to a lesser degree, untamed ferocity relics, because
Yeah,
those two buffs direct damage generators, which is also what Moc buffs, right? So if you have a lot of them for whatever reason, that's when Moc becomes viable, basically. And like it doesn't really even Moc with say Sabretooth, which isn't a super good combo. Like if you have 3x VFR and like 2x untamed ferocity for whatever or something like that, which isn't very strong, but you just end up with a gear. Like yeah, Moc might just be better than BT anyway. Um, so yeah, I guess they aren't really a build, so I shouldn't talk about them as a build. That's more my point. But
yeah.
yeah,
I did think that was going to be one of the questions that we get from this. Do I need to play Predator for Wild Flesh Rend? Do I need to play Predator for Mock, or do I need to play Mock for Predator? But yeah, they're not really linked, but
no,
they
they aren't
do
linked,
have
but it's
synergy.
yeah. It's just that typically you're in the same situation. Like if you are big on AoE, like you really focus on AoE, there's a massive AoE, and that's the primary focus of what you want to gear for. The way to gear for that is maximizing swipe, and you do that by stacking Wild Flesh and around Team Ferocity and maybe Gushing Laceration. And that also syncs up really well with a mock build, which buffs the exact same thing. That's why they would be pseudo linked because they use for the same time. Because in that scenario, we would definitely have Predator as well. But it isn't so much the Predator and Mock synergize as well. In fact, they actually synergize pretty poorly with each other because
More energy, more energy, more
then
energy.
you can use yeah. It's actually more so the damage increase from Omen than the actual energy gain when you're Predator.
Yeah, cool. We've discussed that. Might as well touch on other talents that are underrated a little bit. So, Incarnation. I know you thought about using Incarnation on Jaina for a bit.
Yeah.
Obviously, Incarnation is a lot worse in Sustained, but it does still have that value in AoE.
Yeah,
Not
exactly.
in AoE, in Burst. Fuck
In
my
burst.
life.
Yeah, not definitely don't pick it for AoE. So the first is much better. But the thing with it is, people do underrate Incarnation a lot. Like people say, I see a lot of people say it's trash. It is true that it is trash, quote unquote, in overall sustained single target damage. So if you are doing a 5, 6, 7 minute fight, you basically don't value any particular burst. Like you're just fine with doing damage in any phase, whatever. Yeah, Incarnation is definitely worse. It's like best case, say 2.5%, 3% worse. Best case, and worst case, more like 5, 6, 7% worse than so for. I mean, obviously, this is pretty poor balancing, one would argue, but leaving that aside, where Incarnation do perform better, and it is a little bit underrated, is if you care about damage in say a minute, a span of a minute, maybe 1.5 minutes tops,
Like, say, Jaina Part
Incarnation
3.
is actually better. Yeah, for example, I would say Jaina phase 3 is probably very borderline, so I don't think there's a massive gain unless you have very specific gear to use Incarnation, but it is probably very similar as running solo first. And obviously, in a fight like Jaina, the DPS in the other phases are largely irrelevant. Like, obviously, you want to maximize that, but it's not important, so you don't really need to gear for it.
Yeah, it's all about that last phase.
Yeah, basically, if you don't have enough DPS to do the other phases really easily, you don't have enough DPS for P3, so it's irrelevant, right?
Yeah, you can take a lot longer on the other phases if you get into phase 3 with enough damage. Especially phase 1. You've got so much time for phase 1.
Yeah.
Cool. Do we
I
want
would
to
also say, just quickly add in, similar thing with Feral Frenzy. Like I've seen so many people underrate Feral Frenzy. Like Feral Frenzy is a few percent worse than Blood Talents. It's actually not that poorly balanced. Like yes, it is worse, and there's no particular reason why you would run it. This is accurate. So like I'm not saying you should ever run it, but it's not trashed, right? Like, trash is what Lunar Inspiration is compared to Sabretooth. Like it's something like 10% percent units, so or 10% of your total DPS less, right? So if you imagine you do 25k, yeah, that's like 2.5k less DPS or in that range. That's really bad. Whereas we are talking here about, it might be 500 DPS points worse or something along those lines than Blood Talents. Like just like as a scope thing, like if you for some reason want to burst one target, or you want a very short, fast fight with burst, like Fell Frenzy might very well actually be viable. And in fact, it was viable on like super quick fetid kills last year, for example. Not a lot of people used it, but certainly was viable.
Yeah, I remember having some logs for that.
Yeah,
Really
top 10
entertaining.
logs, right,
Yeah,
on that fight. So actually
yeah,
legitimate good.
yeah. That was quite entertaining. Do we want to just talk briefly about what's the survival instincts trait?
Masterful Instinct.
Masterful Instincts. Because I know we've had some questions about that, and it might be worth touching on it briefly. So, Masterful Instincts gives you a shit ton of mastery after Survival Instincts expires.
And
Cool.
armor, less relevant.
And armor. Yeah, less relevant here, but might as well mention it. So, yeah. So, obviously, this is a DPS game. It's has a significant downside in that you sacrifice using your defensive cooldown.
Yep.
And
it's 6 seconds after. So basically, when it expires,
you have to plan
get
ahead.
30 seconds of Masterful Instincts.
Yeah, it's quite a lot of mastery. Fair enough.
It is, yeah.
So this is a DPS game. Sims won't reflect it because obviously Sims don't use survival instinct because that would be absurd.
Well, yeah. So basically, and I can clarify that a bit more. The reason, obviously, the Sims could use it and emulate it, and you can in fact add it to the APL if you know how SimCraft. But the reason it doesn't by default is because it is typically a bad idea for most people, even if you're low gear, to actually give up using your defensive cooldowns defensively.
Especially with how strong our defensive cooldowns are.
Yeah, and if that was the default behavior, obviously that could, people just running top gear, and it might recommend using Masterful Instincts gear piece, for example, and that is typically a bad choice. Therefore, it doesn't by default. It's not as bad as some people would think. Like, it isn't a good trait, so
there's a potential that there's a scenario much like Jaina Part 3 where you would look at this because you're using your defensive cooldown anyway and you want the burst from it. This isn't something you should really think about or plan around.
Yeah, it's more like it could happen. Like, we could run into a scenario where you have a massive DPS increase or a very, very harsh DPS check or a very, like 30 seconds or so.
While you're taking a load of damage.
Where this might be a thing people do, yeah. I mean, so I guess if we say that you don't care about your defensive code, you're a really bad raider and you never use it anyway, so you might as well use it for DPS, yeah? In that scenario, you basically want to sync, because you have charges right on it, so you basically want to sync it up with every, well, particularly TF, but also Berserk and / Incarnation every time, which is easy to do with charges, fortunately. It's basically, it's maybe 2/3 as powerful as Younger Fury or so, which means it would be, a very average relic. It's not, on sustains against target, which is fine but not amazing, and obviously with a significant downside.
Yeah.
So that's roughly the strength of it. It's not something that a sim just like hides and it's actually powerful. That's not why it's hidden. It's like a very middle of the pack type trait that has a very significant, and I should just clarify, this obviously a guardian trait. It's not a feral trait really, but it is usable for feral, like all traits.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So if anyone logs without, that's big memes. Basically, is what we're getting at.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're doing that, I would probably recommend having at least one untamed ferocity as well, so that you get more berserks or incarnations to stack up with.
To sync up with your survival instincts.
I'm not actually sure if this is a good idea. I don't think there is. I have so far not run into a situation where you want to do that, but I will say there might be such a situation, right? Like, I would say it's plausible that such a situation could exist, basically. That's where we are with that.
In the future.
Yeah. And maybe, if you optimize it really well, it might be a tiny gain, like Jaina phase 3 or something like that. It's plausible, very plausible, but we are not talking about big DPS increases, and we are talking about really, things that are probably pretty dumb to do unless you're like absolutely min-maxing like crazy just for DPS, and like you don't. Because if you're actually maximizing, for your usefulness in a raid, you don't want to do this basically, because you definitely want to mitigate damage more than like a tiny bit of DPS. Like that will almost always be more useful.
Yep. Okie dokie. Right. Well, do we want to talk about how Battle of Desire Law went for Feral, or do we want to touch on Crucible gear?
Well, we start with Battle for Sardar, I guess.
Might as well. Right, so obviously Battle of Desire Law, the raid we've just had, we've got Crucible coming out next week, so we might as well look at how it went. I felt that Feral was pretty solid. I was pretty happy with Feral's performance. I know Boomkin got a lot of attention this raid because it always does for some reason. I felt that.
Well, there were a few fights that were certainly very range favored.
Yeah, and fights which kind of enforced having ranged, that's just life, kind of. Rastakan. Blockade, I think, goes 50-50 either way, Feral or balance. But I think it might be a little bit balance favoured. But yeah, so I think there were actually a fair few fights where the opposite applied as well. Mecha Talk, I thought Feral was really good, and this might be time to talk about Stampeding Roar. Stampeding Roar is fucking constantly undervalued.
Yeah, it was really good this raid actually. Almost every fight you can use it to help, and it is very noticeable when you have it and when you don't, for how easy it is to do mechanics, especially if you have, for example, Shadow Priests are pretty meta right now, so if you have Shadow Priests, they're very slow. Death Knights, not so meta, but still they're very slow. Those kind of classes especially, it makes it a lot easier for them when you can Stampeding Roar them for mechanic.
Especially on fights like Mecha Talk, where you get like forcibly grouped up, or Jaina, where you're also grouped up.
Yeah, Jaina it actually helps a lot, especially in P2, which it's probably the easiest phase, but still, like, it does help, and it makes it a bit more consistent. It's really nice. Not so useful on Blockade. It's pretty good on Resto. It's really good on Conclave. The running to the Conclave is an easy fight, but still, it's really
running
useful
out of the orb or running out of the circle.
Yeah, or
running
getting
to the
circle.
circle.
There's tons of situations in that fight was really good. It's pretty good on Opulence as well. There's a lot of movement on Opulence. It's pretty long.
And you're grouped up again.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Stampeding Roar is kind of in the situation where it's kind of not that great until it's good, and then it's really good.
Yeah, like I feel like it's almost every fight you find a spot for it where it's decent at least. So it's almost never bad. And it is something you should keep in mind and use. And if it's not a sign, you just use it as whenever it is a good opportunity. If nothing else for yourself.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So, what else in Battle of Desire Lord do we want to talk about? Gear was really good for us. Azerite traits really solid.
Yeah.
Might as well talk about Jaina. Pretty easy to get weapons.
For those who don't know, in theory it's pretty easy.
For those who don't know, Zan still hasn't gotten a weapon for Battle after Desire Law, despite bonus rolling every week on a weapon boss.
Yeah, I'm growing in Blockade. Yeah, probably I don't know, but at least 10 coins I think I burn it. It's ridiculous at this.
Tragedy. So yeah, easy to get a weapon. So we might as well talk about Jaina, as I said, because that is kind of the most important boss. I think it's probably where most guilds spend most of their time.
Oh yes,
yeah. So I think obviously part 3 is probably the most important part. Well, not probably, is the most important part. So as well, might as well touch on that first before we look at any other parts of the fight. Feral's burst isn't too incredible here. Our survivability is really strong here.
Yep.
Yeah. That's kind of...
Our survivability, on every fight is good. Like, compared to the average class spec, whatever. Like, the healing we have just basically freely available, especially if you go Rest Affinity, but even without. Just the passive trickling healing means that you're almost always very high up in health, and the fact that you have doubles charges of instincts as well when you need for special things is just really, really strong. And even Bear Form are a lot less useful, but you can use it for stuff like Siegebreaker as well.
Yeah, and we've got some mobility for running Siegebreaker out there as well, which is nice.
Yeah, mobility is nice, very nice.
So yeah. So obviously a lot of the questions about Feral on that phase would probably come down to Feral versus Balance. Um, and I think Balance probably has the better burst for that phase. I think Feral has its strengths there, and whether or not you should play Feral or Balance probably comes down to how good you are at either of those specs.
I agree with that, yeah. I feel like it's like first thing attack damage was never really certainly isn't on that fight either.
Yeah.
I think we're middle of the pack on the P3 damage as well if you play it well, obviously. I would say something that is a bit frustrating with Feral's DPS number on single target is that it is very random right now. Like crits and inside TF and stuff is very significant and impactful.
Loving me
But
some Tiger's Fury crits.
yeah, especially if you have a lot of younger Fury relics, which it's really easy to have because of how much how good they are on paper.
How good
But
they are and how easy they are to get on raid gear.
yeah,
Since we can get three of them with two good 1 point wonders on just raid
yeah,
gear alone, which is obviously really nice. Um, but it is fun, yeah, when you have 80% crit and you have 20% crit rate on your opener. Love it. I know you love that
I,
too.
mhm. I feel like when it comes to the balance versus Pharaoh thing, I really do think that it's mostly not that important of a differential. I feel like to
Yeah,
some degree balance isn't in a great spot compared to other range specs either, while balance is certainly a good spec. I feel like, for example, Shadow or Warlocks do kind of beat down most people in terms of raw power anyway.
yeah.
So if you
They're
look
just
and you
reasonably
compare,
absurdly overtuned at the moment.
yeah, and if you look at all bosses on Warcraft logs, obviously it's very biased towards the fights where you do the most raw damage, which typically is AoE fights anyway. And especially in this tier, there's so many fights where you can pad a lot like champions if you're ranged multi-dot. But those DPS numbers are completely irrelevant, so I would just not.
Yeah, like if you look at damage to bosses, Feral is like, I think it's actually number one at the moment.
No, on all bosses it's number 3 at the moment. But yeah, it's up there basically.
Yeah. So yeah, so that's that. Feral's pretty good. As well, I think it's been reasonably decent for a pretty long period, outside of maybe a bit in Uldir. But
It
after
certainly
buffs in
was.
Uldir, it was
Yeah,
certainly
yeah,
fine.
certainly had some problems. Yeah.
But yeah,
I feel like even in M plus, people are underrating Pharaoh's raw damage a bit. Like
yeah, oh yeah,
if you
for sure.
compare to, for example, Outlaw, which a lot of people like to do. Yes, it is true that Pharaoh's damage is bad compared to Outlaw. That is certainly true, it's unarguable. But you must keep in mind that most specs are bad compared to Outlaw.
By
Like,
most, you mean
the,
all?
yeah, certainly. Like, my point here isn't that there aren't other specs that are better than AoE damage as well. There certainly are. But my point is, if you compare to, some kind of average, Feral isn't in a bad spot. It's actually probably in a pretty good spot. Like certainly, I would say over like the top quartile probably raw damage. But obviously, we don't have any special utility that would make us super appealing. Soothe and dispels and stuff and of healing is
especially when,
okay,
yeah,
but it's not amazing.
especially when people are running Resto Druid healers.
Yeah,
That
which
kind of
obviously
just,
almost everyone is. So
yeah, yeah. Um, but yeah, we've talked about this before in other episodes. Damage has never really been the problem. It's always just been that utility. Utility
yeah, and
brings
it's
so
also
much
yeah,
essential
and I
DPS
feel
value.
like it's also one of those cases where if Feral actually has so you can get away with being a spec that don't have utility, but it is always important that if you don't, then you basically, to be super appealing, you have to be either the highest or almost the highest DPS, right? Like that's being a normal DPS spec, even a bit above average, and not bringing anything particular, just make you pretty uninteresting. Like fine, certainly, but uninteresting. And I feel like that's the Fairlight at the moment. We are pretty uninteresting as far as the spec. Very there's nothing super strong, very obvious, oh, this is a good perk you get from being a feral, right? You don't get a damage buff, you don't get a shroud, you don't get, for like that, you don't get insane burst, but it is all right. And I feel like actually the community perception has started to shift a little bit. It's a little bit easier to find as well.
Yeah,
Because it is
I think
starting
it
to come
can.
around, and the fact the fell isn't that bad. It's all right, it's just an exospec.
Yeah, but it just takes time to change community opinion like that. So we'll see how that goes in the future. And whether Feral does fight back in the community's opinion or whether it remains looked down upon. But I think it will, especially if performance remains as it is currently.
Yeah, so it's also
Right.
not very. I mean, people still think Feral and come in and say stuff like, "Oh, Feral is so complicated," which
It's
given
really
how
not. It's not anymore.
yeah, currently it's not very complicated. It's like fairly average as far as specs goes, I would say. I mean, maybe it's a bit like almost every spec is worth noting is pretty easy compared to what every spec used to be, But I would argue that Feral isn't more complicated than anything else. It's pretty easy, pretty smooth right now, honestly.
Especially with how Sabretooth works.
Yes, especially that.
Cool. Right. Do we have anything else we want to talk about in Battle of the Zara lore? Touch on Jaina.
Oh yeah, actually, yes, as a side note, I feel like a lot of so I certainly am a big fan of balance affinity, and I use balance affinity a lot, and it's very convenient, particularly in Jaina, like intermission, and
Yeah, you did
certainly you
mention
can use it to
this.
get more damage. Right? Like I certainly think you do slightly more damage if you have it on a lot of fights, especially Jaina. But for maximum utility, you can actually get a lot of healing for very low DPS cost with Resto. If you actually take opportunities where you are pooling or you have run away from the boss, for example, or you are in the intermission phase on Jaina, or there's tons of situations on most bosses where you have even a little bit of downtime where you can cast, for example, a wild growth. There's a lot of healing. You can cast swift mends, on people are low or on yourself as a health stone kind of equivalent. It's really, really powerful. Like there's a lot of healing you can do. You can probably, if you actually focused on it, I wouldn't be surprised if you could get like 10k HPS or something on a fight like Jaina, which is a lot. Um,
Yeah.
and that's obviously a very underappreciated utility, and I think it's frankly underused. Uh, so it's something I think people should definitely look at. Like, if you have any issues with healing on a fight whatsoever, it's a very high damage incoming damage fight, for example. Maybe, Jaina is hard because I think that fight in particular, balance affinity does give you a lot of that are pretty nice. But on some fights, like Blockade, for example, balance affinity doesn't matter at all. In that case, you might as well run rest affinity and progress, for example. Obviously, on a fight like Mecha Turk, where yeah, I mean balance affinity is all right, but not amazing. But certainly, you have a downtime phase where you might as well use rest affinity to heal a lot. Like I feel like you definitely should consider us using rest affinity.
Yeah. Still have your weak aura.
Yes, my weak card.
Right. So let's talk about Crucible gear then. So let me bring up my list here, which I got because I'm prepared. Right. So let's start at the top of my list, which is Trident of the Deep Ocean. Um, So that is the taking damage has a chance to form a protective bubble around you that absorbs incoming damage, and when the bubble bursts, it increases your primary stats for 1 minute, stacking up to 3 times. This has no secondary stats and no primary stats. Um, so yeah. So if you're
For
taking
this,
damage, like Guardians do, it's pretty easy to maintain 3 stacks.
yep.
If you're a feral and you're aiming not to take damage, probably not as easy to maintain 3 stacks.
So think about it like this: ideal case, you take damage on cooldown, so that the damage mitigation is useful on its own because you will take this damage and it basically mitigates damage, and you can use it on cooldown, so you constantly have this buffer list. In that situation, it is still inferior to a similar high level weapon that doesn't have this special effect but has secondary stats and primary stats baseline.
What we're getting at is this sucks, don't use it.
Yeah, the only case where you would use this is if you value the damage reduction they absorb very highly, right? You value the defensiveness of it, not the damage, which I'm not sure that's good for Guardian. It might be good for Guardian. That's up for someone, to
I think
vote.
it's quite a lot of primary stats.
Does
Like
anyone
100.
play Guardian? But if you for some reason play Guardian, right, it might be decent, right? You should look up that with the Guardian, like Theorycrafting people. But if you don't value the defensive, it is not good. It's really bad. Don't use it.
It's awful, it sucks, don't use it. Next, Gloves of the Undying Pact. So these are an under-budget pair of gloves with an on-use that's tether yourself up to 5 allies within 20 yards. After 3 seconds, you're healed for 25% of the health restored to tethered allies, up to 0 total healing. That's a tooltip error. It's higher than 0 total healing. Again, these are under budget, purely defensive. Next, they suck.
Wait. So unlike the Trident, like at least gloves isn't a massive source of damage. So what I would say about these are they are just used for defensive purposes. Again, as a tank, this is more interesting. If you have them, if it's a fight where you need defensive for whatever reason, maybe they are alright. Yeah, maybe you use them. But keep in mind, you never use these because you want to do damage, right? You're using them only because you want defensiveness, right? That's the only use case for it. They are bad for DPS. Just use normal gloves if you want DPS.
Cool. Next one. So, boots, Stormglide steps, under budget boots, but they have an equip when your auto attacks grant untouchable for 15 seconds, stacking up to 15 times. Untouchable grants crit, and taking any damage removes all stacks of untouchable. These are actually semi-interesting.
Yeah, except if you read the number. But so the idea behind this is they give you more crit, right, than normal pair of boots. The amount of stats you get in the best case, which is you have this uptime 100% of the time when you attack double end of the
and you don't take any damage.
And you never take any damage. At least, I don't know, I don't think it is removed if you absorb the damage, so I guess any unabsorbed damage. You still get basically a normal pair of boots at the same eye level.
They're slightly over budget if you have full stacks, but again, over budget on boots is not a great amount of stacks.
Yeah, like basically, so I would say about these, they might get buffed. If they get buffed, they could very well be interesting because we stack it. In theory, we stack it pretty quickly when they fall down, etc. Right? But the problem is you need to have 15 stacks for them to even be, viable as a DPS item compared to normal boots without any drawbacks. That's not good enough, right? Frankly, that's not good enough. If it was, say, you need to average 7 stacks for these and they are viable, whatever. So if you get any more than that, it would be better. I could buy it. Maybe they would be decent, right? Or maybe if you just lost 1 stack every time you take damage, or something like that. Yeah, then we could start talking. But the way they are designed right now, on a fight like Jaina, it's completely useless, for example, because you just taking damage every 4 seconds, whatever, at least. Completely useless. Like, these are probably gonna be bad, frankly. Unfortunately.
Cool. Right, next. Leggings of the Aberrant Tide Sage. So, an under-budget pair of legs. These are a bit more complicated. While above 60% health, your damaging abilities have a low chance to deal damage. While below 60% health, your damaging abilities have a low chance to restore health over 10 seconds. Yeah. I'm not sure what low chance means in this context. Let's have a look.
I did some math on the current tuning. They are probably more or less DPS neutral with same high level legs.
1 plus haste proc per minute.
Yeah. So basically, my guess is if you don't have any specials to deal with nature damage, which most people don't anymore, they remove most interactions. These are probably alright. I would say on average they're probably worse than normal pair of legs at the same high level, but they're not, unlike the other pieces that we talked about, they aren't horribly worse. So they might even be slightly better if you are a spec like that doesn't scale very well with secondaries, for example, or if you don't have any other good legs. I would say these are probably fine if they get like 5-10% buff, like they might even be good.
And of course, advantage being they drop at 420, so cool.
Yeah, which is nice. I would say they aren't super important. They're probably alright. These are the most alright gear piece of.
So far.
If you use it, obviously they're useless on AoE because it's a single target proc, and the secondaries are better on AoE than this. So that's also a draw. But as far as average single target legs, these are probably fine.
Cool. Last piece now. Lurker's Insidious Gift, which is a trinket. So on use, embrace Nzot's gift, increasing your mastery by X amount for 30 seconds. Every 1 second, gain suffering, inflicting shadow damage per application. It's actually been changed on PTR recently, so I'm not sure how it's supposed to work now. Previously, you could reactivate it to remove the buff, but that wording has now been removed from the tooltip. However, you can cancel Aura the buff. So we don't know quite which way that's supposed to work. It's a pretty good trinket in terms of DPS if you're not worried about dying.
Yes.
Obviously, it'll do quite a lot of damage to you, which is a concern. But if you can keep it up for a decent amount of time, then it's probably a pretty good trinket.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess that's the important bit to point out. It's probably you need to sim obviously compared to other trinkets like always, but I think this is probably alright. Like this is by far the most. This might be a good trinket, right? If the damage isn't too bad, then it's fine, and your heal
Well,
is
put
good.
it this way, it's almost certainly better than Kimball's, which is
Yes.
our second best raid trinket. Probably not better than Vigor, but
Probably not.
it's probably a pretty good second trinket if you don't have like a big Mythic Plus trinket. You just need to be aware of the downside and not kill yourself.
So yeah, it is a use. Obviously, it means you can use it together with things. I think it's probably it might even be a bit above average trinket. I think it depends obviously on the exact numbers and tuning, and they might balance these again. But it's not like some super amazing trinket. But I think it's
Yep, cool.
that's my gut feeling about it at least. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty much it. Right, that is all of the gear from Crucible. Cool.
Yeah, as you can see, we aren't overly excited about this raid here.
Yeah, there's nothing too much exciting. It feels a lot like they kind of forgot that DPS leather classes exist. Maybe rogues have like a cool dagger or something, but
yeah, I feel like a lot of these gear pieces are like the effects could in a different world where Blizzard were less obsessed with balancing things, which is funny coming from me, right? Because I am not necessarily a big fan of the balancing, but what I always say is Blizzard are pretty good typically to balance stuff like item budgets, so there's no like this piece is massively above budget and much better than other pieces, except for some cricket, but for some reason I just grab it because reason.
Yeah, Blizzard trinket balance is always interesting.
But, yeah, but as a drawback of that, pretty good balance, typical balance is that now, we had this issue where some trinkets are simply. These gear pieces are, theoretically best case similar to normal gear pieces that doesn't have any unique effects. And I mean that's not good enough for a thing.
That's not ideal, especially when you have a down drawback. Yeah.
Like that's just unfortunately the case.
You probably want greater risk reward.
Yeah, and you probably also, if we have done Battle for the Sarah Law now. People that raid Mythic probably have more or less full Mythic stats. People that Heroic have full Heroic sets. Some Mythic pieces. Like the problem is these are like similar or very very small upgrades over what you have. Like that just makes them extremely unappealing, and there's no asteroid either. Right? It just is very unappealing. But,
we'll see how it goes. Right. Well, that is us for now. We'll wrap up, and I will say we'll make another episode sooner than we did this one, but no promises because I said that last time. If you listen this far, thanks for listening, and we will see you next time. Peace.